All righty. Hello, everybody. Here we are today for the first of many USDA Consensus Fireside Chats with Mike Moore. This is a new series featuring a special guest. Today we have Sasha Mackler, Executive Director of the Energy Program with the Bipartisan Policy Center, here to talk to us today about biomass and CCUS, or CCS. Before we start, just a few words about our program, our hosting program. I'm Michelle Littlefield. I'm a program coordinator with the USDA Consensus Program, we call it for short. This is a cooperative agreement with the Department of Energy, Fossil Energy, and Carbon Management. So this program seeks to educate the public, policymakers, industry stakeholders on CCUS and carbon management technologies, with hosting public webinars along with a series of monthly educational briefings. We have conference workshops, technical reports, and CCUS and carbon management related updates. This will include rare earth elements, critical minerals, blue hydrogen, environmental justice as it relates to carbon management, and tribal energy articles to our interested audience. If you would like to join, please send me an email to the address at the bottom of your screen. So a little housekeeping, feel free to use the Q&A button during presentation to ask questions, or use the raise your hand option if you would like to speak live. This webinar will also be recorded and posted to our event page at a later date, most likely on Friday. But we appreciate you taking the time to join us live. And with that, I'll introduce Mr. Mike Moore, our host.
Michelle, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for taking the time to spend some time with us today. Like she said, this is the first in a series of these fireside chats that we're going to do through USDA. Been around the space a little bit and get to bump into some interesting insights, and thought maybe we would find some good topics like this one we have today to talk about. We'll bring a special guest up, and more of a fireside setting rather than a formal set of presentations and panels and what have you. Today, Sasha Mackler is our lead, and he is somebody I've had the pleasure and honor of knowing and working with for the last at least 15 years, from CCS projects up to his work in biomass to where he's at the Bipartisan. He's the executive director of the energy group at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I've been in the space, CCS space, since about 2002. Spent a lot of time more on the CO2 EOR side in the beginning, to the storage, and then development and the project development side, and carbon markets as well. So it's kind of spread all over. My role at USDA, I'm program director for the work we do with the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. And our keen interest here is really the tail end of the pipe, the storage part, which we'll hear from Sasha as well. It's a real critical component for the whole scheme of things, especially with all the federal incentives that are coming out and are available, such as 45Q, that requires the storage part to be done in a manner that satisfies the EPA and the IRS. With that, I'm going to bring Sasha on and let him kind of give you the background where he's at, and then we'll kind of starting a dialogue around the idea of BECCS. And by the way, one of the things that kind of prompted this particular one today was there was a news article not long ago, very recently, that a group out of Europe called DRAX has been doing this fairly successfully in Europe, and has an established presence in the U.S. for sourcing their biomass for their power generation. In the news article, it announced that they were looking at 10 sites in the United States to do a BECCS project at, which was pretty fascinating. It was more on the power side. We do have a substantial volume of BECCS activity around ethanol and CO2 capture there, but this is a power set, and this is going to be, it was an attention getter, and I figured it was time to do a little fireside chat. And with that, Sasha, it's all yours for the moment.
All right, thanks, Mike. And hey, everybody, great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation. Got a little old school biomass behind us here for the fireside chat, which is a nice setting. So happy to dive in. Why don't I start, maybe before we jump into the conversation, with just a little context on Bipartisan Policy Center, what I'm doing now, and kind of how my perspectives have been shaped through, as you just referenced, about a decade in the private sector working on these issues. But maybe start with the BPC. I lead the energy program at the Bipartisan Policy Center. As many of you may know, but maybe just to refresh your understanding, we're a federally focused policy research and advocacy group here in Washington, D.C. I have a team working on energy and climate issues of about 15 people, and we focus on a range of topics and initiatives that span from energy innovation to energy entrepreneurship to sectoral decarbonization, permitting reform, tax credits and tax incentives and other incentives for commercialization of advanced technologies. We have a Farm Bill project that's looking at how forestry and agriculture can participate in the energy transition and in the suite of things we need to be doing across our economy to manage climate risks. And we have a carbon management program where we're looking at all range of business models and technologies and supporting policy and regulatory frameworks from point source capture on power plants or industrial facilities to direct air capture and other engineered forms of carbon removal, which is a fast growing area of interest and enthusiasm, both commercially and from a policy perspective, as we are thinking about kind of the full set of solutions to help our economy hit net zero by mid-century. So that's sort of a little bit of a snapshot on BPC. The way we work at the BPC is really focused on, what's possible in the near term from a policy perspective to help to support and accelerate the energy transition while maintaining energy affordability and security. We partner very deeply with our friends in the private sector, from the existing energy companies to emerging energy companies to the financial community. We also work very closely with the environmental community and sort of the research and expert and advocacy community and academic expert community on all sorts of issues. And we like to bring all those stakeholders together using the best evidence and data that we can find to assess and unpack the most important policy challenges that we face, and then see if we can collectively develop, in a bipartisan manner. That's sort of in the name of the organization. That really is in our DNA. Find those bipartisan solutions that are shared broadly, and then we work through our C4 BPC actions to really try to make them become law. So that's kind of what we do at BPC. Strong, long-standing focus on carbon management. And I'll just say, maybe before I came to BPC to run the energy program about 4 years ago, spent about a decade commercially working on carbon capture and biomass projects, both domestically and internationally. Spent about 6 years with a group called Summit Power Group, which was a developer of power and industrial facilities that had a long-standing business in sort of power plant development, combined cycle gas plants in particular. They had launched the wind and the solar business. And I had joined Summit sort of right after they were awarded a $450 million grant, actually, from the Department of Energy in a previous demonstration program that they had set up after the Obama era stimulus bill called the Clean Coal Power Initiative. And that project that was funded was called the Texas Clean Energy Project, and that was a commercial scale carbon capture project in West Texas. And that was really the beginning of Summit's interest in carbon capture as potentially a new development line. So I had joined up with Summit to see if I could help kind of support all the needs of that project, the Texas Clean Energy Project, but then also take the information and the learnings and the network that we had been building around TCEF and see if we could leverage that into other carbon capture projects and really see if we could develop a business model for carbon capture. And we were looking at sort of post-combustion capture on both coal and natural gas power plants. We were looking at how are we going to actually figure out a business model and a regulatory model for storage that could support the carbon capture project. Looking at the market development side of things, how could we monetize the low carbon products that would be produced from carbon capture projects, and then the policy needs of this whole business case. And so I spent about 6 years at Summit working on those initiatives, helping sort of with the formation of sort of the whole reform agenda 45Q, which has now become the linchpin of the carbon capture business model, thinking about other ways in which we could monetize the environmental benefits of carbon capture projects. The low carbon fuel standard in California was another area of focus. and then helping to work with EPA and others in this, well, at that time was a small community. It has grown quite significantly since then, to see if we could help to sharpen and solidify the regulatory frameworks, particularly around the Class 6 program at EPA, which is, I think, as we'll talk here further in this conversation, Mike, really a central piece of any business case for carbon capture, whether it's from coal or gas, or from biomass, or from direct air capture. So I spent a lot of time working on all those issues at Summit, just as backdrop for all of you. And then in my time after Summit, I spent about 3 years working for a company called Enviva, which is the largest biomass fuel supplier to the global utility industry. And so what Enviva has done, and at Enviva, I was really focused on market development and that, which is really customer cultivation and really business development in new areas, in a similar role that I had at Summit. Really pulling in the policy world and the commercial world to see, if we could build a business case for biomass projects in new markets. And so I was leading up that work for Enviva in the Americas. So as part of that work, I really sort of started to understand very clearly both the opportunities of that are presented by biomass as an energy feedstock, and then also some of the challenges or other complexities of biomass that need to be really handled very carefully if it can meet the the opportunity that it presents. And so that's sort of an ongoing issue. And what Enviva has done and continues to do is really sort of resolve one of the main challenges that has bedeviled biomass historically as an energy source, which is its heterogeneity. It's sort of it's hard to get a uniform supply of biomass, both in terms of its actual characteristics that you would use for energy, and also its seasonality, and then with the supply chain itself, disconnected the source of the biomass from the use of the biomass. They had built up at Enviva one of the largest, probably the largest global supply chain for biomass that has now kind of helped to create a commoditized global market for biomass, where a lot of the supplies of biomass that come out of the southeastern US go around the world, just as we ship other energy products or other agricultural products around the world. And so really interesting time. And now with this whole question that you put before us here, Mike, is kind of, can the carbon capture opportunity and business case be combined with the biomass opportunity and business case to create something kind of new and different? And I think there's a lot to be said about that, but I look forward to unpacking that.
Thank you, Sasha. It's certainly a fascinating space right now. On the ethanol side, you've got the 3 mega projects, Navigator, Summit, Tallgrass, that are out there that are capturing CO2 from ethanol plants, and going to have trunk lines taking substantial amounts of CO2 to storage. These are all under development now, and I think, like any other major project, they're discovering some things along the way, and but they're big, and the federal incentives that are out there have been very helpful for this to take place. This particular case, with the using the non-ethanol side and going over to the biomass side, in this particular case, again, we're looking at this forest products, pellets. I'm going to assume is what Drax will look at. That you're going to need a lot of forest products, which they're set up to do, that really only them and Enviva have the capacity to do. But it's a geographic issue. They're down in the southeast for the most part, if I'm not mistaken. And most of your storage capacity is going to be further west of them, along the arc of the Gulf Coast, or maybe some areas up in the Midwest. Depends on where they may decide to take and put their projects. Like I said, they've looked at 10 places. I don't know that they would build 10, but whatever they do, it's going to be interesting, to say the least. And it's not just biomass. There's municipal waste. It kind of fits, not forest products, but there's other agricultural waste, bagasse from sugar production. There's talk about using the byproduct of hemp manufacturing and processing I think that there's talk that the Navajo out at Nappy will use their feedstock for gasification for hydrogen production. There's a whole wide range of resources for the BECCS process. It'd be interesting to know at the end of the day on the storage part. Our work back in the early days of CCS, we were kind of the storage part was looked at as the end of the pipe. It was like, that'll sort itself out. And what we're finding out is actually probably the most important part of the project. You really can't capture much of the value from the federal programs unless you get the storage part done right. And that then takes us to a lot of interesting places that are already in play. Sasha, what do you see in the scope of things, all the different areas that BECCS is being looked at for? And we've kind of hit just a couple here. Drax's power production, and the other one is the off product from ethanol production. But there's a lot of other market areas for this.
It is probably helpful to start there. Kind of what are we talking about when we're talking about BECCS? And just like when we talk about carbon capture, really it can mean many different things. Carbon capture, it can, as I already alluded to, and as you've been talking about, there's different sources of CO2, there's different uses for CO2. And so CCS or CCUS can really be a blanket term for many things. And the same goes for biomass. There's a whole range of potential feedstocks for biomass and different applications or business models that might be applied to the utilization of those feedstocks into different sectors. And so maybe it's helpful to start with like, what are the pathways that are kind of in play now when we think about BECCS, because it does combine several sort of existing sort of industrial opportunities with some new ones. And it really kind of shows the breadth of what's happening and the breadth of the opportunity. Corn ethanol, I think, with carbon capture is what a lot of people can go and look at today and say, well, that's kind of an emerging BECCS project. There's a Decatur, Illinois project that is run by ADM, that is an ethanol plant that is capturing its CO2 and injecting it underground, is also funded by that same program that I referred to earlier from the Department of Energy. That's a BECCS project. And other ethanol plants are looking at doing a similar thing. It's really kind of a first mover opportunity when it comes to BECCS, because the process of creating corn ethanol throws off basically a pure stream of CO2. So there's not really a challenge in the capture part. You can just collect that CO2, and if you can compress it and find a place to put it, you've got a BECCS project. So there's that as I think one very interesting kind of line of thinking. And what's possible there from an ethanol to CCS perspective is that I think really driven by kind of the 45Q credit that was just enhanced and improved upon in the Inflation Reduction Act, can through the higher value of the 45Q credit and the longer time frame that the credit will be available, I think can support a lot of those kind of first mover BECCS projects like the corn ethanol. But then there's a lot of other things that you could imagine becoming BECCS projects. There are the sort of combustion to power pathways, which is really what Drax is currently doing in the UK, which has been to convert an enormous coal-fired power station from the use of a fossil fuel, coal, to the use of a renewable fuel, biomass, as a pure combustion project, which, if done well, can really bring the all-in life cycle emissions of the power plant, to approaching sort of zero, right? I mean, of course, there are some supply chain emissions and things you have to do around the sustainability of the feedstock. But if you consider the fuel carbon neutral, you're burning a carbon neutral fuel. So you're getting pretty close to zero net emissions from a power station. But if you combine conventional post-combustion capture technologies onto a power plant like that, then you start to have a carbon negative project that is producing an energy, a base load or dispatchable energy product with carbon removal. And that sort of combination of value streams, I think is really interesting. It's interesting to Drax, clearly, and I think it could be of interest to others. Now, the business case there, which maybe we should talk about in a few minutes, I think there's still some uncertainty there, but it's a really interesting pathway to explore. Then there are some other pathways, right? There's the use of bio feedstocks, either agricultural residues or dedicated energy crops, or using the sort of the wood supply basket that we have in certain parts of the world. In the Southeast U.S. is the largest we have here in the U.S. Or sort of wood products that are taken off of lands, maybe public lands that are at a wildfire risk, or overstocked forests, which is sort of a different thing. And those feedstocks could become, used in an energy context, either for the production of, heat and electricity through combustion and steam process, or through advanced technologies and making things like biohydrogen or sustainable aviation fuels. And then you have maybe different products you need to monetize, and all of this, the idea would be that you would leverage carbon in the bio feedstock to produce an energy product, and then capture the residual carbon and then do something with it. Most likely it would be carbon storage or maybe carbon utilization. So those are the main pathways. There's another pathway which I think is emerging, very nascent, but it's worth keeping an eye on, which is just a project that uses bio feedstocks for pure carbon removal. And Charm is a company that is doing just this. They're taking bio products and turning it into sort of a bio oil, and then not doing anything else with that oil but injecting it underground for long-term storage. And so the product there is carbon removal, and that's another pathway that is worth considering. So those are sort of that's kind of a landscape, I would say, of what's out there and what's being talked about. And I think it's important to say here that the value, the business case for doing any of these really depends on, number one, establishing very clear rules on how you do the carbon accounting for these projects and how you manage the environmental or the sustainability sort of issues associated with sourcing the biomass. That's a really big issue that I think more work needs to be done. And then that has to be combined with what sorts of revenues can these projects actually generate. And in the work that I've done, and I think probably broadly shared with the group that's listening here, if they've done any work commercially on these topics, is that the value of the carbon capture, the carbon removal piece of biomass is really central to finding a business model that works. And we're still in the very early days of figuring out how to monetize sort of the CDR, or the removals piece of all of this. But that's going to be very important. But if we're able to crack that nut, then I think there's some real opportunities here.
We've had a couple of questions come up, and I think I'll grab them real quick as we go forward. One of them was David Carr, and his question was, how much CO2 has Drax captured and permanently stored at its biomass power plant in the UK?
Well, so I can't speak for Drax, in terms of what they've done so far. My understanding is that they're in the process of transitioning from a pilot sort of post-combustion CO2 capture system on one of their boilers there, which I think is pretty small. But they have a very ambitious plan to move to a sort of full-scale post-combustion capture sort of enterprise at that Drax power station in the UK. That would, I think, ultimately capture around 8 million tons per year if they're able to achieve what they want to with their plan. But I think they're still at the early stages of that right now.
And then I got another one popped up, and this is from Ash Nasta. I hope I pronounced that right. Are coal-heavy states like Wyoming and West Virginia considering fuel switching biomass in their coal power plants?
Well, it's been talked about, right? I mean, I think that switching to biomass or co-firing with biomass is an option that utilities have looked at, on and off over the years. I haven't heard really any announcements or any activity really in doing those, large utility generation scale facilities, sort of switching to biomass, kind of in the near term here. The power markets right now with power pricing where it is, probably, I think, pretty clearly wouldn't support that conversion unless there is something further that is figured out on a monetization of the carbon benefit of doing something like that, because there's a pretty significant cost
Right.
associated there. Now, if you're able to couple that conversion to biomass with a carbon capture facility, I know that there are groups looking at that, in certain parts of the country. You probably have a more interesting value proposition, because then you're creating a low carbon electricity or zero carbon electricity product with a carbon removal. And then if you can monetize that carbon removal through voluntary carbon market transaction or some other way, there's a I think a really interesting opportunity there. But again, the markets for that are not quite figured out. But if you look at the value or the cost of generating that removal from a project like what we're talking about here, and compare it against the cost of removals from other pathways, for example, direct air capture, I think it's pretty clear that a biomass with CCS platform can get you that removal product at a much lower cost than we can get today with DAC. Now, over time, those cost curves may change as DAC, as direct air capture is able to scale up and we get learnings and innovation there. But currently, I think the bio with CCS approach is going to be able to deliver removals at scale much more quickly at a lower cost than what we could see through other pathways. And so to the extent we're optimizing for net zero today, and I'm not saying that we are quite yet, but to the extent that we were, bio with BECCS projects like the ones we're talking about here, I think make a lot of sense. But until we do that, the business case is strained. You have to find either ways to get an uplift in your energy product pricing, whether that was sort of in the power markets or in some fuels or steam sort of hydrogen or steam or fuels context, with something in the voluntary carbon market that could support the economics.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And by the way, there's a lot of work that's been done, various studies. There's two that I'd recommend if you haven't seen them already. One, the NETL put out, and it was the techno-economic and life cycle analysis of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, a baseline study. And it was out July of 2021, and it's fairly extensive. Would recommend taking a look at that if you haven't seen it already. Kind of addresses some of the things that will be popping up either now or later in this discussion. And then the Energy Futures Initiative did one surveying the BECCS landscape, which is fairly exhaustive. That came out January of 2022. They're both online and available for download. And again, a lot of supporting information behind what Sasha's been talking about in both of those studies. I know there are others. Those are just two that happened to get my attention. We're getting a few more questions coming in. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm gonna roll forward with more of our conversation and then step back into these questions that have come up. So bear with me. And then Sasha, in terms of what we're seeing, so DRAC's announcement it was kind of like that. Yeah, wow, we've got companies coming in from overseas using our subsidy systems and support systems to do low carbon commercial development, whether it's power generation, feedstock for something else, whatever. We've got not just the US focus, but you have the international community is taking a hard look over here. And the 45Q is one of them. And of course, some of the money out of the different bills that were passed attracted them as well. what, in terms of BECCS, this is I mean, from your own experience and where I've been with this, especially on the storage side, it's not for the faint of heart. There's no instant package out of the box that works all the time, everywhere, all at once. There's lots of nuances, and maybe kind of touch on that a little bit, that this is, whether it's BECCS for carbon capture and storage, or it's any other process, some industrial process, we still have to get it in the ground. You still have to get it there. You have to get it recognized and accounted for. You've got to go through a number of different procedures for all these things to stack up and be quantified and qualified. How do you see all that?
Yeah, well, so you have to solve for a number of different problems, or you have to solve a number of different things simultaneously to make a BECCS project work. One is, what's your fuel supply, right? And historically, biomass-based projects have been constrained by the radius of your fuel supply system. You not like natural gas or coal or other facilities you can site anywhere and bring the fuel. Typically, biomass projects need to be located where the fuel is. And now Drax and Enviva and other companies have sort of taken a little bit of that constraint away with their commoditization of woody biomass. But there's a lot of capital that needs to go into the infrastructure to create that homogenized product and the supply chain there. So that's something that is still, I think, really needs to be front and center as we think about where the geographies are, where biomass makes the most sense. And then those facilities need to be proximate to a storage solution, right? Unless, there might be the CO2 pipelines, hopefully for that will take CO2 from projects to storage reservoirs, are going to become more abundant in the decades ahead, especially as we transition the economy, and hopefully as the programs at the Department of Energy and the tax incentives that were just passed kind of help to get capital deployed into this part of the challenge. But I think for now, we really need to be connecting the fuel supply with where the storage opportunities are. And that kind of leads you to a couple of geographies. One, where are there abundant forests that have resources that could be applied to these problems, or agricultural areas? And when you look at forests, we can start with forests. The Southeast is, I think, sort of the most natural place to focus, because as opposed to some of the other forested areas in the US, and there are plenty, but the Southeast is kind of unique because it is a broad ranging forest system that really spans from Virginia all the way through East Texas. It's enormous. And it is, by and large, privately managed forest. So it's very different than a forest we have in many other parts of the country that are on public lands. Privately managed forests are just that. They're landowners that have these resources, and they manage them for an economic return. And so that's where you see pulp and paper industry. That's where you see a lot of the timber industry coming out of the US is in the Southeast. And so there's a lot of infrastructure in place today, and sort of an economic industry in place already that is sort of managing those lands, I'd say, pretty productively. And it also gets at some of the counterfactual issues around, well, any tree left standing is better for the environment than a tree that is harvested, which is a very compelling argument. But in many parts of the world, and particularly in these privately managed forests, that's not actually a good counterfactual, because the landowners are managing these lands for economic return. So they're going to find some way to monetize these lands. And the biggest risk to forests in the Southeast actually is conversion from forest to agricultural use, where you just sort of change the landscape entirely. So that's one opportunity, is sort of figuring out what's your sustainable supply chain. And the other advantage that forests have, especially privately managed forests like those in the Southeast, is that they are not part of a cyclical agricultural cycle where you have, time where you're not harvesting, so you don't have a feedstock supply. Forests are harvested and managed sort of year round. When you get into other forests, like what we find out west, really, where they're sort of on public lands and managed as national forest system, there are opportunities because those forests are they're really under stress, right? From wildfire and from first of all, from wildfire suppression for over a century. So now they are overstocked and they're not really in a natural balance. And so there's too much biomass in those forests from a natural sort of sustainability standpoint. So there's a lot of work going into, okay, how can we make them healthier? And a lot of that boils down to taking some of the lower value or sort of newer or sort of kinds of biomass in those lands out of the land, so the forest can become healthier, or take the dead trees off the land that have died through pine bark and other things. And so those could be sources. Those harvests and those conservation practices could become sources of energy, but you get into other challenges there around the economics of basically building a fuel supply chain system in those landscapes where there is no industry now, and it's very disaggregated in terms of how you would sort of build up enough of a supply chain to really have an economical project. But there's an opportunity there for sure that needs to get figured out. And then how do you match those supply chains with the storage resource is a challenge. I mean, we can talk about how you actually develop something like a Class 6 well, which is going to be a constraint for biomass. It's going to be a constraint for conventional carbon capture projects. That needs to get sorted out. But these are some of the issues that really need to be resolved.
It just kind of ties back to a question that popped up I hadn't addressed yet. And somebody is asking, if you use federally sourced wood, like doing forest clearings and what have you to tighten them up, does that change the makeup of what you can go qualify for in terms of federal funds? Does it matter that the trees are on private property, or that or any of the resources that you would use for biomass, if they come from federal lands or if they come off of private lands? Does it matter?
Well, I would say it doesn't matter from a 45Q perspective.
Right.
But 45Q rewards a project for tons of CO2 captured. What are you taking out of the smokestack that would have otherwise been emitted? How much are you injecting or storing underground? That's the 45Q metric, which is useful in the sense because it's very clear cut. It's for biomass, it puts it at a little bit of a disadvantage because you're not doing a full life cycle accounting and sort of valuing the carbon that's stored against against alternatives. Because if you were, the biomass would actually be more valuable from a carbon storage perspective, because you're going to be having a bigger climate impact because you're taking carbon out of the biological system and putting it into the geological system. That's a really big carbon benefit. But 45Q doesn't give you that, but it does give you very clear credit if you do it. There are ways to monetize the utilization of, to get back to your question on federal forests, but that's really, through, I think, USDA-based or U.S. Forest Service grant programs that are trying to help support the economics of forest conservation and forest, preservation activities. But you have to kind of stitch those things together. It's not a clear, at the moment, it's not really a clear way to kind of get it all bundled up nicely into a carbon credit or some incentive. You have to put those pieces together yourself. And I haven't seen yet anybody really figure that out.
Right. So somebody else had asked the question about where all the CCS projects at, how many are there? And I guess the answer, I'd throw this out there, is that the Global CCS Institute, GCCSI, has a fairly robust tracking system in there for all, not just the United States, but globally. And they're fairly up to date, and they keep that updated fairly, I'd say pretty religiously. The other one is the you've got the DOE is tracking and keeping track of things on their sites. There's obviously have a keen interest in that. And
Yeah, I think the EFI paper also has a really good list
So
of,
they-
from the BECCS perspective, what are some of the projects that are out there?
right, buried in one of the questions was, how does this work towards the low carbon fuel standard credit out in California? Any of the BECCS stuff?
Yeah, well, so there are developers, technology developers or project developers that are trying to get into the LCFS program, which could be a real supportive way to finance and get BECCS project built. Low carbon ethanol, if you can deliver it to California, where we started this conversation, sort of, the ethanol plant to do carbon capture, if they can deliver their ethanol to California, there's a pathway there where those gallons of ethanol can generate an LCFS credit. You can also, there are technology companies today that are looking at using agricultural residues in California. There's an enormous agricultural sector there in the Central Valley, where they could take the sort of the residues and some of the feedstocks or leftovers from the agricultural process, use them in the production of kind of sustainable or green hydrogen, do some carbon capture associated with their process, and generate carbon negative credits or LCFS credits. So there are different ways to monetize that. Now the LCFS program doesn't have a fixed price for its credits, and so the credits kind of go up and down. So it could be a really nice revenue stream for these for this pathway. And I think California, even the policy apparatus in California sees biomass as a real enabler of their long-term climate goals from an energy and a carbon standpoint. But it's hard to finance these projects on the back of LCFS because of the challenges associated with fixing your LCFS price in your revenue model. So those are things that need to get worked out. But looks like there are some really promising sort of new development activities in California that suggest that they have a really strong framework there.
It's a fascinating space, to say the least. The one of the parts about the CCS part is the storage, the infrastructure, the pipes to connect the CO2 from the source to where you're going to sink it. There's been a tremendous amount of work by the DOE in the United States and the labs, and also private and commercial interests in the universities. There's been a lot of work done internationally, off the coast of Norway and other places, about the veracity for storage. There's a high degree of confidence that large-scale CO2 storage will work at a kind of at a high level global perspective, but it's really local. There's lots of nuances to what happens when you store CO2, the geology that you're in, the conditions, a lot of moving pieces there. And to get qualified, there's a series of steps that you have to run through with the EPA for your permit to get for the ability to drill a well and operate a well to inject CO2 for geologic storage. And there we start to run into some unique, regional nuances. I keep using that word maybe too much. So you have the geology part, but you also have something else. Unlike most of the world, in the United States, we as private citizens or commercial enterprises can own the resources below the surface. Most anywhere else in the world, it's the crown, the family, the government that owns all the resources below the surface. And so if they decide to do something somewhere subsurface, they do it and deal with their public as they may. But here it's different. Outside of federal lands, we own the mineral rights. The individuals do. They own the pore space rights. They own the water. They own this, and they have the surface rights. There's a legal system and a contract system that stands the test of law very well. It's very efficient. It's very efficient in protecting rights, It's also very efficient in how things can get buried in legal
Sideways.
legal interests. So pore space. Up until 10 years ago, most people probably didn't pay much attention to it unless you're in the oil and gas industry, or you're doing liquid waste in the old wet waste disposal systems. But pore space is where the CO2 is going to go, and there's been a lot of discussions about where that sits and who owns it. And some states, like North Dakota and others, have given definition to that. Other states are sorting through it now, and there's a lot of effort as to, does the mineral rights owner have that, or does the surface rights owner have that? Some states have made a declaration as to who is that, and there's been some legal challenges on some of that. Now, if you're going to store CO2 in a geologic setting, you want to be pretty confident it's going to stay where you put it, generally, for an indefinite period of time, and be able to show that indefinite period of time is doable. But the other part is you got to show that you got the legal rights to leave it down there forever. And we're seeing some interesting cases surface where some folks just aren't in a big hurry to lease pore space rights for something that has an indefinite timeline on it. Or we have some geology that needs a little bit more research on it. We ran into things with disposed water from the other parts of the oil and gas industry that we got to see some seismic activity in a couple of states, and it prompted a lot of activity around how to mitigate what that might look like. Well, if you're going to do large scale CO2 storage, you're probably going to get a certain amount of produced water that comes with it. And you don't re-inject it back to the place you got it from. It's got to go somewhere else. And we're right in the middle of a major shale boom in West Texas and other parts of the United States, where they're also producing a lot more produced water. And so you're gonna find yourself kind of competing geographically with some folks that have to take care of water. You got to watch some of that out in West Texas, but it's changed a lot since then. And part of the process of finding and doing a due diligence on a project is the technology for capturing CO2. There's lots of stuff you can pull off the shelf, a lot of stuff being developed. The process that you use to create the CO2 stream that you're going to capture, there's a lot of different ways that that's going to get done. And you can't capture the 45Q unless you got the end of the pipe sorted out. Like I said earlier, when we were in this 10, 15, 20 years ago, we were kind of the storage part was kind of the, oh yeah, that'll take care of itself attitude. And I think we're finding out that actually the storage part is the critical component, because if you can't get the storage, you're not going to get the 45Q.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really important point that you just made, Mike, which is the ability to have a storage solution for any of these kinds of projects that we're talking about is central to getting your financing, to having a viable business case, and to building the project. And I think what you're sort of suggesting is that there was always an assumption that the storage would be there when you needed it. First of all, because we've done the technical assessments and we know the US is endowed with enormous CO2 storage capacity. We have really good reservoirs for storage kind of spread all over the country. I mean, some places are better and bigger than others, but it's pretty widely distributed around the country. And the other part of it is that, storage it's rock science. It's not rocket science. I mean, it's really not that complicated. There are things you need to do it well, but it's not like we need a lot of innovation in this space to figure out how to do CO2 storage. We've been doing it in the oil and gas industry for decades. We've been moving CO2 around through a network of 5,000 miles or more of CO2 pipes, and we've been managing pure streams of CO2 with compressors and injecting it underground for decades in a well-regulated, very safe way. We know what the CO2 does when it goes underground in a well-characterized reservoir. So this should not be that hard, really. It's paying for it. We got to figure out the economics and the business model to pay for it. But the process of doing it And in theory, the way that we regulate it should be pretty straightforward. It's figuring out all these other pieces of the innovation on the capture side and other things that has historically been a challenge. But now that we see a lot more activity in the carbon capture space, becoming clear that we're not going to be able to realize the opportunities that we see in front of us with carbon capture if we can't move more quickly in developing storage reservoirs, partly due to what you were saying around this, a little fuzzy around how we're actually going to get the rights to inject in some places, not in all places. Actually, I'm pretty optimistic we can figure that out, but it's not crystal clear right now. But the regulatory approval process for what's called a Class 6 well, which is the well that's used to inject CO2 deep underground for storage, that has proven to be up to now very slow, incredibly slow. And if we don't pick up the pace there, it's going to become a real bottleneck in for all these really interesting technology pathways that we are seeing kind of unfold in front of us. And so that needs to get resolved and resolved quickly. There are a number of applications from, I think, very well characterized reservoirs around the country that are sitting in front of EPA right now. EPA is the regulator that needs to approve those applications for a Class 6 well. Those need to get moved through the system. And the other thing that EPA could do is grant primacy to states who are very well positioned from a technical capacity in some cases, especially in states that have an oil and gas industry where they've been regulating wells and underground injector for a long time. They could pick this up and adhere to sort of the EPA guidelines, but manage it at the state level. That could help move things along more quickly. And so you're right to highlight it. This is something that will affect me.
Just yesterday, there was a letter sent to Reagan over at the director administrator for the EPA, asking them to expedite the granting of primacy to the states that have requested it so that they can get on with the permitting process for their Class 6 wells at a state level. Right now, there's only a couple of states that actually have the primacy. It's Wyoming and North Dakota. And there's probably a bit of a queue of folks that have stepped up in with applications at this point. There's other parts of the country where the CO2 storage projects are they're lined up. There's announcements all the time of new CO2 hub systems being not contemplated, but moving forward on with land acquisition, infrastructure layout, what have you. But the key for them is that Class 6 permit to do the CO2 injection. Anybody has done project development knows that the money doesn't necessarily have the same sentiment the developer has about how things will get done. You set up a set of milestones to get the money under terms and conditions that are favorable to both the developer and the funder. If milestones aren't met, you give the funder an opportunity to rejigger the terms of the equation, which typically don't work to the benefit of the developer. And if you have too many delays, the terms blow the project off the table. And so we might be seeing some of that. If we can't expedite the permitting process through the EPA, then some of these mega scale projects that require that permit process to be moving down the line and get done change.
Yeah.
And it's really, I don't know what holds it up at EPA. I'm not going to speculate, but there's certainly a lot of people that are asking them to expedite that.
Yeah, well, we see, this is why the BPC focuses on permitting and permitting issues generally in the energy system, because this is not unique to carbon capture. We see this with transmission, see this with pipelines.
Sure.
We're talking about it here in carbon storage. This is an issue that we face broadly, just speed for permits. And this, it's a real priority. And I'm optimistic we're going to figure it out. And there are, I think, things happening that suggest that we will see more primacy granted to states, which I think will speed things up and probably see the EPA start moving some permits more quickly.
Sure.
At least that's my view. I'm kind of an optimist on this. I mean, and maybe just to back it up a little bit, because I know we're kind of getting to the end of this conversation, and just talk a little bit about maybe my reflections, or summarize my views on where biomass with carbon capture kind of sits as an opportunity set. It really requires some ability, I'll just repeat maybe what I said earlier, to monetize the benefits that are being brought forward. And biomass with carbon capture could bring forward a lot of really interesting energy and climate benefits. It will be the most scalable and the lowest cost carbon removal opportunity that we see for the next decade. And if we can monetize that, that is going to really deliver, I think, a lot of benefits. If we can take advantage of the system benefits that a dispatchable or reliable source of low carbon electricity brings into the power market, and I think some customers are starting to kind of really get interested in that. There's a whole 24/7 clean power agenda that is taking shape that has a lot of interesting groups involved. BBC is one of them. Google is helping to spearhead it. We see really, I think, encouraging leadership from some of the private sector folks in the voluntary carbon markets that want to support high quality, high integrity, long-term sort of carbon removal credit markets. And so I think Biomass CCS can participate there. And I think the technology innovation that we're seeing on the capture and the development side, like I mentioned, Charm earlier, I think what Moat is doing in California is very interesting. What Drax is talking about from a biomass with power perspective. These are all really, really, I think, compelling ideas, and the pieces are starting to come together.
Sure. Well, I'm optimistic as well about how this moves. We've seen a lot of forward action just in the last 36 months. The last 24 months have really kicked it into high gear. Been I think a number of entities have been waiting in the wings, ready to jump when things had aligned, like the funding that came out on the federal level and the tax credits and what have you, and a number of other things that became supportive. So it's moving, and there's a lot of people that in this space dedicated to advancing it. One last couple of things. There's somebody asked the question: is this an issue about regulation and permit process, or the level of uncertainty of designing CO2 storage site? And it's more about the regulating and permitting process. We've got a huge amount of research that's been done on geologic storage there that sits in our labs, in the universities, in the commercial entities that are here, and not just here, but elsewhere around the world. And Peter Connors threw a quick question out here from Oric. And he was asking about, for the 45Q, one needs to capture the CO2. Where does that occur? Here, what happens at the point in some of our processes where the combustion takes place, or maybe gasification. And then what is the carbon capture equipment involved in the process? So it could be, Sasha, there's a number of different ways that.
Yeah, there's a number of different pathways here, so it's kind of a hard question to answer. On a conventional biomass power plant with carbon capture, you use, sort of your typical post-combustion capture system, which would be taking a pretty dilute CO2 stream in the flue gas and collecting it and concentrating it. That's what we see in other applications. On an ethanol plant, it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's a fairly pure stream. It comes off the fermentation process. You just have to collect it and compress it. Some of the more advanced approaches for using biomass to create sustainable hydrogen, that's going to go through most likely a gasification process where you do a shift reaction, part of the gasification process, and then you would have a stream of CO2 you could pull out at that point before you went on to produce your hydrogen, or use that syngas for something like a fuels product.
The low carbon, no carbon, negative carbon feedstock. Yeah. So one last parting thought: having an interest back in earlier career life around CO2 EOR, I'll wager that there'll be a few more CO2 EOR storage projects pop up, because the ability to permit that process can be done today. It has a different carbon footprint, of course, than if it's pure storage under a Class 6 permit. But if you need to expedite a piece of your project, my guess is we'll see a few of those projects surface fairly soon rather than later.
Yeah, I think you're right on that, because of the pathway to demonstrate storage in a Class 2 well. It's getting a little wonky, is pretty clear cut, and Class 2 wells kind of exist today, so you could get a project moving pretty quickly if you took that approach. You're going to get a lower tax credit for that, which I think makes sense because you have a lower carbon benefit, but there's still a carbon benefit. And from my view, we're going to be using oil in this country and globally for decades to come. There's no doubt about that. It's not an opinion. It's really, if you look at any of the projections from EIA or IEA or even IPCC and other groups that look out in the long term, even in climate constrained scenarios, there is a need for oil and for gas decades to come. I think it makes sense to be producing that oil with as little carbon impact as possible. So CO2 EOR coupled with carbon capture, to me, if you do the math, is a pathway that makes sense from a climate standpoint if it's done responsibly and if it fits within a broader climate strategy. So I think there's a climate rationale for that. I think there's an economic rationale for that, and there's a speed rationale for that, as you just hinted, because of the regulatory systems in place. We're going to eventually need to be figuring out how we take a lot of the CO2 out of our system and put it underground, at a really high volume. That's going to require a lot of Class 6 wells. But getting started with Class 2 wells, to me, is not a bad place to start.
Well, there's a number of different pros and cons, and I handle, sit with the pro side a bit, but we'll save that for another fireside chat.
Yeah,
and it's 4:30.
That's a
4:30. Yeah. So thank you very, very much for taking the time out of your busy day to spend an hour with us today, Sasha. And it's always a pleasure to run with you. And looks like our fireplace background stayed up and it worked.
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to chat. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. So for those that are still on, this is recorded. It will be available on the USCA website. There'll be the information of the two studies I mentioned. There'll be a piece up there and maybe some other follow-on documentation that might have been referenced in this program. No presentations to be downloaded, but the video piece and recording will be available for public access. And Michelle, is there anything you'd like to throw out there before we formally shut her down?
That is all. I think you covered everything. Thank you very much, Sasha, for being here, and Mike, looking forward to the next one.
You bet. Thank you again. Thank you for everybody that stayed with us. Thank you, Sasha, and thank you for being my first person to run this with.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
Have a great day.
All right, take care.